Thank you very much. In 1937, there was a new Fred Astaire movie. One of the songs that came out of that movie was called "Nice Work If You Can Get It." The nice work to which the authors were referring was prostitution. But the song stayed in the culture. It became popular for a reason that goes beyond brothels. It was that 1937 was a year when Americans were thinking quite a bit about work. It was the 8th year of the Great Depression. Unemployment was in the teens and heading up. Some people had jobs, others didn't. There was this new social divide in the country. That disparity is worth spending a few minutes on, 10, I hope, because it does have relevance for today. When we study the Great Depression in school, we learn maybe John Kenneth Galbraith version, the stock market went too high, causality, or we learned the collapse of the Match King or the Kreditanstalt in Austria, monetary banking crisis, that's what caused it. Or we learned that it was all monetary, specifically as per Milton Friedman. And we learned, what did we learn about the social changes of the 30s, the social laws? Well, they were on balance good for society generally, and maybe also for the economy. You think of a hero from the period like John L. Lewis. What did we take in, internalize? John L. Lewis was tough, he had big eyebrows, but well, it was good, it was kind of heroic, it was our own tame little version of the Soviet Revolution. But when I did work on the Great Depression recently, I found a different story. Some combo of the business cycle, the market cycle, monetary policy, banking, and international events covers the explanation for the first part of the Great Depression, maybe. But when you get to the latter half and you see it going 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, that cannot be explained by those traditional dynamics. There's another component at work here, the labor price. The labor price was too high. It was a big factor, and it's what made the Depression, because when we talk about the Depression, we're talking about duration. That's what our parents told us, 11 years, 10 years, not 4. What do I mean by that when I say labor price? When you look at the 20s, as late as the 20s, companies and individuals had expectations about what happens in a downturn. Companies get in trouble. They lay off workers. Maybe they also cut wages, or they fold, even if they're Detroit-based automakers. There were Detroit-based automakers who folded in the recession crash of the early 20s. Unemployment in that recession, the early 20s, went way high up into the teens, but for a very short moment. Then it went back, and the average for the 20s, as you probably know, was below 5%. A lot of that was flexibility. You could hire, you could fire, you could change wages. But even in the 20s, even before Keynes was known here, the theory was growing. We had our own proto-Keynesians here, that wages ought to be high in a recession. Some of the push for higher wages, of course, came from Henry Ford. You've heard the phrase, if you pay workers well, they buy back the car. And that can be true, of course. So in 29, when the next big break in the stock market comes, there is a different policy response. President Hoover calls big employers to Washington and exhorts them not to drop wages. He sends out a statement that says you shouldn't initiate, I'm quoting, any move for wage deduction, keep it high. There's Owen Young of GE, Julius Rosenwald of Sears, Laughlin of Laughlin Seal. They're all there, and they're saying wages must stay higher. The president wants it. As the Depression deepens, as you know, Hoover also signed Davis-Bacon, which puts upward pressure on wages. There were opponents, but this despite them. So in this period, the early Depression, wages don't go down as much as they otherwise might have. Employers lay off people, and they're more hesitant to rehire. So you get one factor that's driving that famous high unemployment. In 1932, 1 in 4 men was unemployed. FDR had the same labor philosophy. The difference between Hoover and FDR was that Hoover was a constitutionalist. FDR used dramatic new constructs to institutionalize higher wage culture. First, he did it with the NRA. We have our NRA, they had theirs. The National Recovery Administration passed in '33. The NRA codes had the effect of a forced minimum wage. The idea, again, was to push up wages so people would spend more, get the economy going. And if you look at the data, you'll see the pushing had an effect. If you're an NRA industry in the early 30s, your wages are 20% higher than other wages in the economy. The NRA was a flop. Unemployment dropped. Maybe if you really squeeze it, you can say down to 10% or so. There was a right-wing think tank that wrote a damning analysis of the NRA, a 1,000-page report, and said on the whole, this NRA is retarding recovery. And the name of that right-wing think tank, by the way, was the Brookings Institution. But the labor part of the story isn't over, because when the Supreme Court throws out the NRA, within months we get the Wagner Act. The act is less directly about price and more about what we know, organization of labor, power, giving unions power. What we learned in school, again, was that it was kind of romantic. They could demand higher wages. As you know, in '36, Lewis's constituents rewarded labor for the Wagner Act by contributing strongly to the landslide of 1936. Their reward, in turn, was they got higher wages, mostly after the election. Real wages rising in a depression is perverse, but that is what happened. When the Supreme Court upholds the Wagner Act 1937, business has no choice but to pay more, and it did. Various tax features play a role here. There was such a thing called the undistributed profits tax, which was forcing companies to disgorge their money. So you're more willing to disgorge it to pay more for labor because you have to disgorge it anyway. This is the period of the so-called depression within the depression. The Dow plunged again. Some ascribe that, Dr. Romer, for example, to monetary factors, the doubling of bank reserves, various contractions subsequent to election, monetarily, fiscally, labor. This can also be ascribed to the Wagner Act and labor policy. There are two economists I want to mention, Harold Cole of Penn and Lee Ohanian of UCLA, who have done the work that I'm laying out. They chart it, they find, and you look at it for over the course of the entire century, the 20th century, you will see wages 20% higher in the 1930s than trend for the century. That's perverse. Even when unemployment is 15%. Hours down, wages up. So my interpretation, having studied it, is that unionization in the 30s didn't help labor. It helped some workers, but it hurt the overall economy. The phrase that we use now, wages are sticky downward, that's not a natural law. That's just an economic rule produced as a justification for a political process, rewarding unions. The bitter labor price component that I just described explains the popularity of the phrase, nice work if you can get it. It also explains another Depression phrase that echoes from our parents and grandparents. It was all right if you had a job. That divide. Just briefly, I'll say, what about now? Even before, it's different and the same. Even before the current crisis, we had this trend which we chart, which shows that after each recovery, it's harder for the jobs to come back, or they're not the same kind of jobs as Harold described. This evidence, what I just laid out, suggests that something counterintuitive to some of us, that maybe the labor price is too high now. And you can begin to see the logic in that when you include the costs of mandates that we don't normally think of as money, but that is a cost, or we include the benefits. And we all know that the benefit of health insurance is one of the things giving employers pause before they rehire at this point. In the Great Depression, the numbers didn't look high. Why not? Because they had a deflation. Now they don't look high because a lot of the costs of employment are hidden. So the question is, what about a new paradigm? What I've laid before you is to say, I think we're following the old paradigm, and there's a lot problematic with that. The evidence suggests you can generalize, and I want to say it again. Labor price matters in recovery, very, very much. It's a fallacy that you can placate big labor or public sector unions in the way that they demand, and at the same time foster sufficient growth for the rest. More generally, you can raise the cost of employing someone and increase benefits, and that will be not bad for the rest. That's a fallacy too. So the way one might sum up the dream of higher wages is nice economy if you can get it. But you can't. Thank you very much.
I don't know about all of you, but I've always suspected that the Brookings Institution was secretly a right-wing organization. I guess that now confirms it.